The horrors of Stalin and the Soviet Union he developed was only possible with the backing of loyal men willing to carry out his often violent desires. The subject of today's video was much more than a simple yes man. Lavrentiy Beria. Lavrentiy Beria for a time was the head of the infamous NKVD, which was a secret police force. He was able to position himself close to Stalin, feeding his ego. In such a position, he carried out purges of tens of thousands of people, whilst using his power to abuse countless women and girls. His bloody partnership with Stalin was not enough to save him from being arrested and executed shortly after Stalin's death. In today's video, we will cover the life, actions, and death of the man often called Stalin's Himmler. Beria was born in Georgia on the 29th of March 1899. His father was a landowning farmer, and his mother was a widowed noble. As a student of engineering during the February Revolution of 1917, he joined the Bolshevik Party. He reportedly served as a counterintelligence agent for the Musovats, an Azerbaijani nationalist group. Beria would be arrested for his role, and he was almost executed, though he would be saved. He claimed he was only working with the Musovats on orders from the local Communist Party, and his execution was reportedly avoided with the intervention of Sergei Kirov, a leader of the Azerbaijani Communist Party. In 1920, Beria joined the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police force. There he rose the ranks, uncovering counter-revolutionary plots as part of the wider Red Terror that swept the region. But the first sign of Beria's ruthless nature could be seen with his actions in Georgia. When the Soviet Union declared Georgia a socialist republic in 1921, many Georgian nationalists opposed the move. The Bolsheviks did not have the support of most of the Georgian peasantry, whilst much of the working and middle classes felt no love for an outside political movement. Political oppression was widespread, with armed resistance common against the Bolsheviks. Beria played a prominent role in quashing Georgian nationalist movements. He led incursions and investigations into nationalist groups, leading to the arrests of many. It is understood that Beria and his agents may have even inflamed nationalists to engage in an escalation of violence. This allowed for the necessary pretext for a complete elimination of political enemies, namely rival communists who had been members of the Menshevik Party. Beria was able to rise to become the deputy chairman of the Georgian secret police force due to his work in destroying political rivals. In August of 1924, Georgian nationalists and soldiers launched a guerrilla-style assault on the Bolsheviks. The subsequent Red Army counterattack employed heavy artillery and planes to great effect, pushing the insurgents into the mountains. Captured rebels and those who supported them were executed, sometimes entire villages at a time, regardless as to whether they were children or the elderly. By September, the rebellion was all but put down, with the remaining soldiers agreeing to lay down their arms following assurances from Beria that the mass executions would be brought to an end. This, however, was a lie. Rebels and their families were executed in prison, all of them without a trial. It is thought that some 10,000 people were executed under Beria's orders. Another 20,000 or so were deported to Siberia, to toil in the horrific conditions in the newly formed labour camps, the gulags. By 1932, Beria was placed as the party leader for the whole Transcaucasian region. He enjoyed his position as a leading member of the NKVD, but his rise would continue. He developed a close relationship with Stalin, emulating Stalin's cult of personality. With the both of them being Georgian with similar family upbringings, Beria was able to placate and play on Stalin's ego and need for praise. Beria would holiday with Stalin, again copying Stalin's holiday home and building his own close by. But perhaps the clearest display of Beria's bootlicking was his publishing on the history of the Bolshevik organizations in Transcaucasia, a book that detailed the fabricated and inflated role of Stalin. By 1934, Beria had risen to the position on the Central Committee for the Soviet Union, the highest ruling body. This very same year, Beria's ally Sergei Kirov was assassinated. Kirov's death sparked the Great Purge. Beria understood Stalin's need for the Purge, and he enthusiastically set about murdering key Soviet leaders in Transcaucasia, those who might prove to be a threat. Many of those Beria arrested and executed were killed following fabricated, unreliable, or non-existent evidence. Seeing his capability, Stalin laid the ground for Beria to replace the current head of the NKVD secret police, Nikolai Yezhov. The infamous before and after photo of Stalin by the river, with one of the figures removed, shows the complete annihilation of those suspected of being treacherous. The figure in said photo was Nikolai Yezhov. Beria himself was almost purged, but was warned in advance. He was able to fly to Moscow and plead with Stalin and secure his safety. In 1937, Stalin ordered the purge of the Red Army. Around 35,000 officers were dismissed from their posts. Of these, tens of thousands were arrested, many of whom were executed. Under the guise of a supposed fascist military plot to overthrow Stalin, the NKVD led the operation. Fear of arrest led to many officers and soldiers denouncing one another. In 1938, Beria was made deputy of the NKVD. He oversaw the winding down of the Great Purge, which claimed the lives of anywhere from 700,000 to 1.2 million. The gulags were filled with forced labourers, making the NKVD not only a political but economic power. Yezhov was framed as solely responsible for the excesses of the purge, with some 100,000 people released from prisons as proof of the clemency now to be offered. Nevertheless, Beria would go on to prepare the lists of dissidents, traitors, or fifth columnists for Stalin to approve their executions. One of those murdered was Yezhov. Beria promoted those loyal to him and set about establishing his power base. During the Second World War and the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, Beria oversaw the brutal Katyn massacre. We do have a separate video on this topic, but to summarize, it saw the executions of tens of thousands of Polish prisoners. The Soviets falsely claimed that the Polish government had fallen following the Nazi invasion, and so they were stepping in to protect the ethnic Belarusian and Ukrainian Poles. Anywhere between 300,000 and 500,000 Polish prisoners of war were captured and deported to the Soviet Union. In addition, members of the Polish establishment were arrested. Many of these prisoners ended up in prison camps run by Beria's NKVD. In March of 1940, Stalin gave orders to Beria to execute 25,000 Polish prisoners. The vast majority were members of the Polish military, mainly officers. So too were key members of the Polish political and cultural elite. In April, some 21,857 people were murdered. This was largely carried out by single executioners, one every 3 minutes over the course of 28 days. The Katyn massacre was designed to rid occupied Poland of any meaningful resistance to Soviet occupation, with Beria's ruthless methods employed to devastating effect. Beria would oversee production of much of the Soviet Union's war industry, working alongside Georgy Malenkov and establishing an alliance between the two. In 1944, Beria was given oversight and command of the Task No. 1, the Soviet nuclear program. In both endeavours, he utilised the massive forced labour manpower of the gulags, with prisoners toiling in factories and mining uranium. One of Beria's most disturbing crimes was the serial abuse of women. Beria would often be driven through the streets of Moscow in the comfort of his limousine. He would spot young women that he would instruct his men to detain and bring back to his home. There, the women would be faced with a feast and plenty of wine. Once finished, Beria would bring the woman into a soundproof office, where he would commit serious SA. Once the woman was allowed to leave, she would be handed a bouquet of flowers. This was to prove to anyone else that the encounter was consensual. If the woman dared to reject the flowers, she would be arrested. Some of the victims submitted to Beria in hopes of rescuing their family from the gulags or prison. A list of victims that Beria had ordered destroyed was secretly kept by his bodyguard, detailing over 100 women. In 1993, building works uncovered a mass grave near Beria's Moscow mansion, with a number of female skeletons believed to be the victims of his predilections. It is understood that many high-ranking Soviet officials knew of his crimes. Stalin himself at one point warned his daughter to never be alone in a room with Beria, for fear of what he might do. Beria had begun to fall out of favour with Stalin in the 1950s, so it came as something of a relief when Stalin was found dying in March of 1953. As Stalin lay in his deathbed, somewhat conscious, it was reported that Beria was in tears, kissing Stalin's hand and hoping for his swifter recovery. But when it seemed that Stalin was about to die, a grin was said to be seen on Beria's face. When Stalin died, he was almost immediate in denouncing Stalinism and the excesses that he had been a part of, and was quick to set about his ambition for further power. Beria was quick to ally himself with Georgy Malenkov, who would go on to succeed Stalin as Premier of the Soviet Union. Beria proposed a number of reforms, namely reducing the influence of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Their powers of detention were to be reduced, with the Gulag program to be run by the Ministry of Justice instead. Over 1 million non-political prisoners were to be released, and many more people exiled from the Soviet Union had their passports returned. Beria sought to allow further freedoms to the non-Russian states, namely Ukraine, as to likely weaken the power base of a key rival, Nikita Khrushchev. The process of Russification and the cult of Stalin were denounced, while Beria sought to reunify East and West Germany. His reforms, however, did lead to an increase in non-political crime, many taking advantage of the amnesty. In June, a series of strikes and protests as to the conditions in East Germany were blamed on Beria's destabilizing reforms. Khrushchev and other members of the Politburo planned their arrest of Beria. On the 26th of June 1953, he was arrested. The circumstances around the arrest are believed to have been an ambush prepared by Khrushchev. At a meeting, Khrushchev leveled his accusations against Beria, calling him a traitor in the employ of the British intelligence services. Despite his appeals to Malenkov, the signal was given to Marshal Zhukov to enter the room with several armed men and arrest Beria. The military moved to prevent those loyal to Beria from intervening, whilst a number of Beria's prodigies were arrested and summarily executed. With his loyalist men guarding the Kremlin, Beria was locked up until nightfall before being smuggled out in the trunk of a car. All manner of public charges were levelled against him, from causing food shortages to putting secret police forces above the party and state. At a private trial in December, Beria and a number of co-conspirators were sentenced to death. It's reported that Beria fell to the floor and begged for his life. There are, however, doubts whether Beria was actually murdered well before the trial. Either way, his body was cremated, and all records of his life were expunged from the Soviet Union. As an example as to how far this went, subscribers to the Soviet Encyclopedia were sent a note instructing them to cut out the section on Beria, which was to be replaced with a section on the Bering Sea that they dutifully provided. Beria's story is an example of one of the loyal, conniving men behind one of history's most brutal dictators. The need for such men are crucial for murderous dictators to achieve their disturbing goals, and this story highlights the sort of people who thrive under such systems. Beria was able to continually rise the ranks to be a potential successor to Stalin, whilst able to act with impunity for his own twisted desires. He rightly deserves the mantle of Stalin's Himmler, an example of the dangers posed by authoritarian regimes and the men prepared to do anything to cling to such power.